Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Amarachi Ubani in Lagos. Here are the headlines today. Rescue continues in Turkey as a young girl and her father are pulled out of the rubble from a building days after. The first shipments of U.S. Bradley fighting vehicles for Ukraine arrive in Germany today. Plus, Cyclone Gabrielle headed towards New Zealand weeks after Auckland was hit by historic levels of rain. More than 22,000 people, that's the number, who've died after a 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck southern Turkey and northern Syria. Rescue workers still putting in the work, hoping to retrieve survivors and, more importantly, praying for miracles. Perhaps their prayers were answered when a young girl and her father were both pulled out alive from the rubble of their building this morning. This happening 101 hours since the quake struck on Monday. Footage of the dramatic rescue showed 80-year-old Tanem and her 43-year-old father, Cem, receiving medical attention moments after they were rescued. Another man in Kahramanmaraş, trapped for 104 hours, recited the Quran as workers freed him. He'd been identified as Police Sergeant Osman. He was carried away by an ambulance soon after he was brought out. Some 24.4 million people in Syria and in Turkey have been affected by the quake. Global agencies have called attention to survivors to save them from another catastrophe. And just across the border into northern Syria, aid has begun arriving for victims of the quake. But health workers say what has been provided is not enough, not even for 20% of those in need. One aid worker described the situation there as the deepest levels of hell. Father Tony Oriodon from the Jesuit Refugee Service says new buildings have collapsed due to the earthquake and others have become unsafe, displacing people across the city of Aleppo. Meanwhile, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was in Aleppo today, visiting the university hospital where most of the victims are being treated. The presidency shared images of him and his wife visiting people. He spoke to those injured and then later spoke to journalists, during which he condemned the West's reaction to the earthquake. And the first time he's spoken since the quake happened, he said it was normal to politicize the situation. A second UN aid convoy for victims of the earthquake arrived in Syria later, crossing the point from Turkey. Officials from the International Organization for Migration say it comprises 14 lorries carrying equipment, including tents, blankets, mattresses and insulators, as well as hygiene and food kits. Getting aid into northwest Syria, territory held by rebels at war with the Syrian government, has been a major challenge. The only access for aid via the single crossing point is at Bab al-Hawa. Joining me now is geopolitical analyst and U.S. veteran Major Adebayo Adeleke. He joins me from Texas. Major, thank you for making time to be with me on the program today. You did spend some time in Turkey, in the region where the earthquake struck. What are your thoughts now as you see the devastation that has been caused by the quake?
It's very devastating. Thank you, Amarachi. Thank you for having me here. And as I've, just like myself and every other that I've worked in the region over the last 10 years or so that I've stepped in that part of Eurasia and also the Levant, we understand the good people that live in those areas. So it's quite devastating looking at the horrific pictures and videos that are coming out of the region about how, the earthquake has devastated the whole region. So it's quite disheartening for me to see, and also to see the rescue work, the slow between, which is oftentimes synonymous to this kind of earthquake that wasn't really prepared for. But it was very saddening. I think it's still saddening. And I've kind of on my own social media, I've kind of put it out, and it's not getting the normal traction that you normally get from other kind of natural disaster. And I think that's another part of it. And not too many people are actually talking about this like they've done to other natural disaster that's happened in the past. So, but we still have to do it one piece at a time to make sure that people are aware of what is really going on in Syria and also in Turkey as well. It's quite disheartening looking at those pictures and videos coming out of the region.
Yeah, so we'll talk about Syria in a minute, but you understand the magnitude of the quake. People have been complaining, as you've mentioned, about the slow pace of work by the rescuers. Many of them have to use their hands to move debris around to get to survivors beneath the rubbles. What do you think has the government shown incapabilities in handling this magnitude of crisis, or is it just caution that's just been applied, which is the reason for the slow pace of work?
Yes, it's excuse me. It's going to be very disingenuous to kind of put the blame on the government at this point in time. So we have to look at a lot of things in context when you're looking at evaluating a natural disaster crisis like the one going on in Turkey right now. If you look at the last time such disaster, there's two earthquakes that happened very close to each other of eight of magnitude eight. And last time I checked is about 200 years ago. So it's not like something that is oftentimes accustomed to. So, I mean, look at the region. It's not something they're prepared for. The housing, I don't think the concrete of most of the buildings over there is well equipped to actually absorb some of the shock that came out of these earthquakes. So, and also when this earthquake happened, it happened in the hours of the morning where most people are asleep. So, which makes it actually very, very devastating. So, you don't even know who is where and what is what. So, and I think those factors in itself can attribute to the slow pace at which some of the regions actually are receiving uh, necessary rescue work. And also, we also have to be aware that as well that a lot of this has to be evaluated to see what is actually needed. Because another point that, having been involved in the humanitarian supply chain and the mineral humanitarian crisis, both in what happened in tsunami and some other parts of the world, it's easy to actually put so much stuff in there that you create so much chaos after the rescue has been done. So the amount of effort, the amount of rescue effort that is going towards the area has to be measured in such a way that it is just enough for them to provide what is definitely needed. Not that when the rescue is done, you're going to have what is called, pollution of materials, which is currently in some part of Turkey right now. I'm seeing over some of my chatters over there that is becoming something that people are pushing so much supplies in there that is not even needed. So all these things has to be properly measured, and the government has to measure it. There has to be a united front, especially in that part of the country. What is going in and what is coming out of it, so there's no conflicted effort along the rescue mission.
Yeah, and unfortunately with earthquakes, they're quite unpredictable, which is what, which is why, you really can't prepare for them. You get ready, but you really don't know when they will strike. But let's talk about Syria now and why it's not getting much attention. As you can see, there's an abundance of footage coming from Turkey, but then for Syria, we have to rely on footage from the white helmets. That's the aid groups, as well as others who are on the ground helping people and helping with rescue. Then two batches of UN aid have crossed from the border from Turkey. We've also not seen much of President Bashar al-Assad at all, except today. What are you reading from the situation?
Well, Syria is quite different. Turkey is a member of NATO and also has some, the Western sympathy as well. But Syria, on the other hand, is completely different. So, as Syria has been under the U.S. sanctions since 1979, since the occupation of Lebanon, and I don't think that sanction has eased up. Actually, in 2011, it has been compounded with more sanction, and the European Union follows suit as well. So it's going to be extremely difficult to get any aid effort into Syria at the moment, especially from the West. And I think some of the propaganda that has been said from the government side that the West is kind of politicizing this, but it's very difficult when all the actions, any attempt to push money through Syria right now is going to be sanctioned. And I think this morning, the Department of Treasury from the U.S. side has actually eased the transaction. But if you look at some of the transaction plays on Syria before, I think it's kind of leave room for humanitarian transactions. But now they've actually lowered it for the next 6 months. We haven't seen the response from the European Union yet, but at least from the U.S. side, they've kind of eased up. Some of these sanctions to allow the flow of aid coming into that region. And also, you also have to also understand what is going on in Syria, because the northern part of Syria, which are Aleppo and all those areas, has been they've been under intense they've been under the intense firing, and they've seen a lot of shock. So some of their buildings are not in great condition. So a lot of devastation actually happened in that part of Syria. So I expect a lot more of casualties coming from that area because of the situation that the country has been to in the past few years. So it's going to be extremely very difficult getting aid into that part of Syria because of the political issues and the war that has been going on. And the third point is Brother al-Assad has been saying that any aid effort that is going to be coming to the region has to pass through his government, because he doesn't want some of his aid to fall in under the rebels. But when it comes to humanitarian crisis, it really doesn't matter. It's about saving lives, either the good side or the bad side, whatever side, how you turn, who is the good, who is bad, either way. But so him also posturing that any aid effort has to come through, excuse me, has to come through his own network is going to be very problematic, especially for the West, because knowing fully well that he's going to only cater to his folks rather than everyone that's actually affected by the earthquake in the region. So those are the reasons why you've seen a lot of friction coming out of a lot of friction, and wide aid rescue is quite slow on the Syrian part because of some of these factors and many more. So those are the three major ones actually on top of my head I can actually point out to that. Those are major reasons why there's a the rescue effort in Syria is quite slow and not that public.
Yes, and I just wanted to add also that it's also difficult to get news from the ground as well, because it's also tougher for reporters to get to that part of the country because it's under rebel hold. Now, international aid already began arriving 2 days ago to Turkey. It's supposed to be racing against time. At this point, do you think anyone under the rubble is at risk of hypothermia if they haven't already died from, the cold? And then we've seen these miracles showing up today, people who have survived 101 and 104 hours under the rubble. Can we expect more of that? And I mean, how long can the human body really last without enough air, water, food, or even sunlight?
It's very hard, Marachi, to estimate, depending on, composition, the will to live as well. Because if you're not willing to live, there's nothing, in this world that can hold you down. You'll give up the ghost. So, I mean, some of the stories that are coming out are very amazing, and it's very uplifting as well. But with the current weather situation in Turkey dropping below, I mean, the freezing weather, and even the rescue workers as well, some of them working for 2-3 days without sleep, and all those things can actually slow down the recovery effort. And to be honest with you, I really cannot, in good conscience, tell you how much, how many people survived this, because as of this morning, we're looking at about 22,000 people died, about 78,000 people injured, and I'm learning about 400,000 people have been taking shelter in hotels. About 6,000 buildings are falling. I mean, I don't even know how can you go to 6,000 buildings in one region. So it's going to be, I'm hoping for the best, but at the same time, I also have to be realistic about the outcome of some of these things, especially with the current weather and depending on the nature of the building and the concrete that they're actually engaging over there. So more bad news might come before we actually, see the end of this.
You're hoping for the best so people have more will to live and that rescue gets to as many people as possible. Thank you again, Major Adeleke, for speaking with us.
Thank you so much, Amarachi.
To the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, fresh Russian strikes hit across Ukraine's energy infrastructure today, causing emergency power outages for millions of people. It also prompted calls for the government for Western arms. The Ukrainian Air Force said Russia fired 71 cruise missiles, of which 61 were shot down by the Ukrainian forces. Explosions were reported by locals and by officials across the country, including in the capital, Kyiv. And while local officials said at least 17 missiles hit the southeastern city of Zaporizhia in an hour, in the heaviest attacks since the Russian invasion in February last year. Meanwhile, Ukrainian school children had to take their lessons at an underground metro station today as the Russian strikes pounded the capital, Kyiv. During air alarms, Kyiv metro system operates as a shelter where people can wait out the danger. At least 3 explosions shook Kyiv and the surrounding regions, with officials saying air defense systems were in operation in the capital and in other parts of the country. Missile debris damaged a private house, 2 cars, and electricity networks in the Politysky district's capital in the capital city. Kyiv's mayor urged residents remain in shelters as the air alert continued over 3 hours after it began. The VOA's Anna Chernikova is on standby for us in Kyiv. And Anna, it is great to see you, considering how intense the attacks on Ukraine were today. And we really appreciate you for joining us, because despite those strikes, the missile strikes in Kyiv, you could help give a sense of what the day has been like since morning.
Good evening. Well, actually, we are currently experiencing here the third massive air alert. No shellings at this point of time, but still, basically, the whole day was under air raid alarm. Over the night, everything began with drone attacks. No drone attacks were reported in Kyiv. However, across the country, there were some troubles because of that as well. And then in the morning, a massive air raid alarm was on, and this led to the massive missile attack. For the moment, we know it was confirmed by the Ukrainian officials that 71 missile was shot by Russian Federation. Today, across Ukraine, every region of the country was under the attack. 61 missiles were destroyed by air defense, and 5 drones out of 7 drones were destroyed by air defense. So in general, people, a lot of people spend their morning, couple of hours of their morning in the bomb shelter. Explosions were heard also across the country, particularly in Kyiv. There were a couple of explosions heard, but all those explosions were the result of the air defense work. Mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, confirmed that 10 missiles were destroyed in the air above the city of Kyiv. I personally heard one of the explosion. I was outside in the morning, and I've heard this explosion outside. It was quite loud. It was so basically it was a sound of a missile of the air defense missile, which sounds like whistling. And after that, couple of moments ago, it was a huge explosion. But basically, this was probably the most scary part. Well, at this point of time, as I already said, it's still air raid siren is still on, but no explosions are reported. Also, the Minister of Energy of Ukraine reported that thermal and power infrastructure were under the attack today, and also high voltage lines were under the attack today. He reported that 6 regions suffered because of that, and the most difficult situation is currently in the western region of Khmelnytsky, also in the Kharkiv region and in Zaporizhia region.
This was quite an extensive amount of damage. I mean, the Russians really meant to hit all parts of Ukraine, as you have rightly mentioned. And I was going to ask about, where the airstrikes were, but you already answered that question, didn't you? So the emergency power supply that has been activated, which is what I suppose you're using now, which is the reason why we can see you even in the dark. How long is that proposed to last, and how soon can the grid be back up?
Look, in terms of energy, for example, I have electricity at this point of time, and but still, after this kind of shelling, of course, a lot of cities and a lot of homes are in the darkness. For the moment, in the morning we had emergency outages, and here in Ukraine, a lot of people were in the dark because of this. Well, in the dark with no heating, with no electricity, due to the emergency outages. Then most of the regions were back to planned outages. So most of homes got electricity back and heating back for planned amount of time, because here in Ukraine it's still the scheduled outages which are ongoing. So as I mentioned, 3 regions remain with very difficult situation in the western part of the country and in the eastern and southern part of the country, but rest parts of Ukraine, rest regions of Ukraine are back to the scheduled outages. So I should say that, and this is according also to the energy officials, that basically Ukrainian energy system is kind of, trying to adopt as much as it's possible. And also when shelling starts, energy companies inform society that some emergency outages will be implemented immediately in order to reduce the amount of damage that might happen. So this gives possibility to bring in energy and electricity back faster than before.
That's really amazing, and a sure way at least of keeping people warm through this winter. Anna, thank you so much for speaking with us, and please continue to stay safe in Kyiv.
Thank you.
Britain's economy showed zero growth in the final 3 months of 2022, enough for it to avoid entering a recession for now, but faces tough prospects in 2023 as households continue to wrestle with double-digit inflation. That's all coming from the Finance Minister, Jeremy Hunt, who says data show the British economy is more resilient than expected, but still not clear of danger. Inflation, he says, is still too high. Monthly gross domestic product data for December, a month marked by widespread rail strikes and bad weather, showed a 0.5 contraction, according to the Office for National Statistics. That's larger than the 0.3% forecast. Output fell 0.2% in the 3 months to the end of September, when many businesses shut briefly to mark the Queen's funeral. And a second consecutive quarter falling out would have met Europe's usual definition of recession.
Well, the fact that we have avoided recession, in fact, we're the fastest growing major country last year, shows there is underlying resilience in the UK economy. But we are not out of the woods. Inflation is still much too high. That is causing pain for families up and down the country, which is why we need to stick to our plan to halve inflation. If we do that and play to our strengths in science and technology, we really can be one of the most prosperous countries in Europe.
Not quite out of the European Union just yet. Brussels and Washington are not seeing eye to eye when it comes to green investment. The European Union says U.S. efforts to spur green technology with the Inflation Reduction Act is making Europe less attractive for investors. But EU leaders are meeting today to debate a response to this. To tell us more, we're joined by the DW correspondent, Chiponda Chimbelu, in Berlin. Chiponda, welcome to the program. And what are the EU's biggest issues with the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, the EU's biggest issues is, of course, that the Inflation Reduction Act essentially makes European-made products less attractive for U.S. consumers. And the Inflation Reduction Act essentially encourages Americans to buy products made in the U.S. and by doing so encourages businesses to make products in the U.S. or in countries that have a free trade agreement with the U.S., and that would be Canada and Mexico. So European-made products won't be able to compete as well as they have in the past. And a good example would be when it comes to, for instance, electric vehicles. So electric vehicles made in the U.S. will, basically will get a tax rebate, at least for the U.S. consumer, of around $7,000. That wouldn't be the case if an electric vehicle is exported from Germany to the US. It wouldn't be able to benefit from that tax rebate as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. And that is, of course, a huge concern, because the concern here in Europe is that more European firms will set up facilities and operations or expand their operations in the US market and, of course, in North America to be able to benefit from some of those tax rebates and other incentives that the Inflation Reduction Act has for green technologies.
Well, thanks for explaining that. But then Brussels, the leaders are meeting in Brussels later today. How are they planning to respond, though?
Well, the most extreme response that has been touted around, it would be a tit-for-tat response. So that would be a similar type of, response to the Inflation Reduction Act. However, that idea has been seen critically because, of course, it would result in more protectionism for both markets. So that is something that is highly unlikely to happen. However, what we've also seen is an idea floated around by France, which says it wants to see a loosening of the restrictions when it comes to subsidies. However, that idea is seen critically because essentially it would potentially favor the bigger countries like Germany and France. So the countries who see that critically, they say that they want to see a common pot for EU subsidies that would basically allow for firms across the EU 27 to tap into those funds and to be able to all benefit equally from those funds, and not that the countries that have more money, like Germany and France, end up being able to disperse more funds to companies within their countries. So that is one idea. The other idea, of course, is to keep on speaking with their U.S. counterparts. Earlier this week, we had the German economy minister and the French economy minister, so that would be Robert Habeck from Germany and Bruno Le Maire. They were in Washington, D.C. to speak with their counterparts about the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act for European companies. And at the end of the day, they weren't able to come up with any concessions for European-made goods. However, what they did agree on with the U.S. authorities was that there would be more transparency about the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. And of course, by getting more information here in Europe, Europe will be able to come up with concrete responses to specific parts of that Inflation Reduction Act. So they do hope to hopefully be able to do more in terms of response going forward.
And speaking of responses, Chiponda, how are European firms responding to this?
Well, European firms are essentially calling for an easing of the bureaucracy around getting subsidies and grants. The process is extremely tedious. There is money here in Europe. There's billions of euros that have been set aside for green investment and green technologies. However, companies have very much trouble accessing those funds. When compared to the US, for instance, when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, that is basically a tax rebate that companies would get when they are investing in green technologies. That is much easier for companies to access. And so that's what they want to see, essentially an easing of the bureaucratic process so that they can easily access those funds. And of course, they are moving on to the US for now when it comes to certain facilities and operations, because they will still want to benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act. But however, if they did get more funds in Europe, they would also be able to produce products cheaper. However, we also have to take into consideration that there are other factors that make the U.S. market more attractive. Energy costs are lower in the U.S., and the U.S. is, of course, an energy producer itself. So in terms of energy production, it is more it's more certain, it's more secure, and it's not just that. Also, in terms of supply chain issues, even though they are tight in the U.S. as much as they are in Europe, it's slightly better over there in the U.S. And obviously, there's a war going on in Europe with Ukraine, and Europe is affected by that. So it's not quite the same. It's not just the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a huge incentive for companies, but there's also other factors which are contributing to the increased investment that we're seeing in the U.S.
Chiponda, thank you again for joining us on the program. And two Israelis, a 6-year-old boy and 20-year-old man, have been killed in a car ramming attack at the bus stop in the occupied East Jerusalem. According to the police, the attack happened at Ramat Junction, adding the driver, a 31-year-old Palestinian from East Jerusalem, was neutralized on the spot. It comes amid a particularly bloody period between Israelis and Palestinians, with a mounting toll from Palestinian attacks and Israeli raids. Today's attack is the latest in a spate of deadly incidents over the past couple of weeks, which have ratcheted up tensions between Israel and the Palestinians. Residents in New Zealand are preparing for Cyclone Gabrielle. 2 weeks after the country's largest city, Auckland was hammered by historic levels of rain. Many communities are still recovering from the widespread flooding that killed 4 people. Authorities fear the cyclone will hamper recovery. Authorities are urging residents to prepare bags of essential supplies, food and water to last at least 3 days, and warn that power cuts could affect automated cash machines. Gabrielle is likely to impact New Zealand's North Island from Sunday, February 12th, all through to Tuesday, the 14th.
We want to remind you that the impacts of this system may differ from what we experienced recently. The addition of strong winds and storm surges will mean there are additional risks, and the impacts will compound those that are still being felt from last month's event.
Yeah, just basically stocking up for the supposed cyclone on Monday. Hope it all goes well, but I just picked up water and some basic necessities for the next 3 days.
Toilet paper, some food snacks, rubbish bags and soap and drinks and some water. We got that a couple of days ago, mainly because we're worried water will be a bit of a shortage.
And as we end the program, apparently cake culture is an important thing in Britain, though the head of the food regulator, Susan Jebb, who has grabbed headlines last month, has compared it to passive smoking. But for people like Katie Mulligan, baking a beetroot cake for her colleagues at a London advertising agency, she's been focused on getting the recipe right rather than whether really it is acceptable now to bring treats into the office. With a passion to bake and cook, Mulligan says her cakes help her colleagues beat the afternoon slump, and beetroot is a relatively healthy option.
I'm going to add in my egg yolks, just 3. It's just the yolks. I like baking for them because it's a passion that I have outside of work. You know, I love cooking and baking, and I think it's just nice to bring a bit of that joy into work. You know, everyone gets a little bit tired and probably depressed around sort of 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so it's really nice to bring out a little treat that's going to cheer everyone up. I think cakes are part of British office culture. I think we love a biscuit with our tea, and a cake is like an elevated version of that. So I think that's something we all have enjoyed historically and even now. Obviously, passive smoking is something you simply can't avoid. If you're, you know, out and about and your friends are smoking around you, there's not really any way you can get away apart from walking away from the situation. But with cakes, it's like up to you whether you eat it. And I've never been in a kind of environment in any of the offices I've worked in where anyone's been pressured into eating one of my cakes.
I guess it's safe to say we do love cakes here on Channels TV, and there's no culture against it. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you later.